For years, Australia's crypto scene was basically the Wild West. It was exciting, sure, but also pretty chaotic and definitely risky. Well, it looks like the sheriff is finally in town. The government has just dropped its long-awaited rulebook, and it is set to change absolutely everything. So, what's actually in these new rules? And what does it mean for you, whether you're a serious trader or just a little bit crypto curious? Let's dive in. Okay, so to really get why this is such a huge deal, you've got to look back at how things were. For the longest time, running a crypto business in Australia was like driving through a thick fog with no map. There were no specific licenses, no clear guidelines, and that uncertainty, well, it wasn't just confusing, it was actually scaring people off. Which brings us to the big question that's framing this entire change. Is Australia finally moving on from being a crypto Wild West? And is it becoming a regulated safe haven instead? More importantly, what does that transformation actually look like on the ground? All right, Section 1, Australia's crypto gray zone. So let's really dig into what that gray zone even means. I mean, think about it. If you don't know the rules of the game, how can you possibly play to win? Or why would you even want to play in the first place? That was the exact problem Australia was up against. And look, this quote from back in 2021, it just says it all. You had a major Australian investor, Mark Carnegie, basically saying, hey, I'm taking my money and my business to Singapore because they actually have their act together. This was a perfect example. Innovators, money, it all flows towards certainty. And for a long time, Australia just wasn't offering any. Right, so the key takeaway here is that this wasn't just some abstract problem on a whiteboard. Real businesses, real investment dollars were packing their bags and heading to places like Singapore, which had already put clear rules in place. Australia was losing out big time. And then something happened. Something so big it was impossible to ignore. An event that sent shockwaves through the entire global crypto market and served as a massive, massive wake-up call for regulators everywhere. I'm talking, of course, about the collapse of FTX. 50,000. Just let that number sink in for a second. That's how many Australians got caught up in the FTX implosion back in 2022. This wasn't some distant problem in another country, it was hitting people right here at home, and they were losing real money. The government simply couldn't look away anymore. Yeah, the whole FTX mess really threw a harsh spotlight on what goes wrong when these platforms fail. Mixing up customer funds, terrible governance, sometimes just straight up fraud. The dangers weren't hypothetical anymore, they were painfully real, and protecting consumers had to become priority number one. So, how does the government plan to stop this from happening again? Well, get this. Under the proposed new laws, the fine for a major breach could be a massive 16.5 million Australian dollars. And that's just the minimum. They are absolutely not playing around. And the message behind a penalty that huge? It's pretty darn clear. The government wants to make breaking the rules not just a cost of doing business, but as one analysis put it, existentially dangerous for these big crypto platforms. It's a direct response designed to prevent another FTX-style disaster on Australian soil. All right, so on to the main event. The new rules arrive. So what are they exactly? Well, the Treasury's finally shown its hand. And what's really interesting is that instead of building something totally new from scratch, they're basically just stretching the existing rulebook for financial companies to cover crypto. And here it is. This is the paper that's got the whole industry talking. Right now, everyone in Aussie crypto is poring over this thing, reading every line, trying to figure out what it means for their future. Okay, so at the very core of all this is a new term you need to know: digital asset facility. Sounds a bit technical, right? But the idea is actually super simple. If a company is holding your crypto for you, that act itself is now considered a regulated financial service. And that changes everything. And this quote right here just nails the change in thinking. For so long, many crypto platforms had that classic tech startup vibe, move fast and break things. Well, these new rules are saying, nope, not anymore. If you're handling people's money, you have to act like a bank with all the serious standards and protections that come with it. Okay, so who does this actually apply to? Who's in and who's out? The good news is the government isn't trying to regulate every single thing. They're being pretty smart about it, really focusing on where they see the biggest risks for consumers. So this table gives you a pretty good idea. The big guys, exchanges, custody providers, stablecoin issuers, they are definitely in. But look at what's out.
Things like most NFTs, tokens you use inside a video game, decentralized protocols. This really shows you their strategy. Regulate the financial plumbing, not every single piece of tech.
So if you are one of those businesses, what do you have to do? Well, the list of obligations is pretty serious. First up, you need a proper Australian financial services license. Yeah, the same one the big banks have. You also have to keep customer money completely separate from company money. That's a direct lesson from FTX. And on top of all that, you need rock-solid cybersecurity and clear rules for audits and handling complaints.
But, and this is really important, the government also realized that hitting a tiny startup with the same rules as a massive exchange would just crush them. That's where this small operator exemption comes in. Basically, if you're holding less than $5,000 per customer or doing less than $10 million a year in transactions, you get a bit of a break. It's a really crucial detail designed to keep the little guys in the game.
All right, let's look at the bigger picture here. What does all this mean for Australia's crypto future? How's the industry actually reacting? And where does this put Australia on the global stage?
The reaction from the industry has been cautiously optimistic, I'd say. Big names like SwiftX and Crypto.com are basically saying, finally, this is long overdue. Kraken also liked the confidence boost it gives investors, but they did throw in a word of warning about making sure the rules aren't too rigid. So yeah, the general vibe is positive, but everyone's waiting to see the final details.
And believe me, this did not just happen overnight. This has been a long, slow journey. It really kicked off way back in 2022 with something called a token mapping exercise. After years of papers and discussions, we finally have a draft. The plan is for the final law to be passed sometime in 2026. Definitely a marathon, not a sprint.
So, how does this stack up globally? Well, Australia's really carving its own niche here. It's not as all-encompassing as the European Union's big MiCA framework, and it's definitely way more organized than the messy, fragmented approach we're seeing in the US. The closest comparison is probably Singapore, integrating crypto into existing financial laws, but with that unique Aussie twist of giving startups some breathing room. And the end game for all of this? What's the big ambition? It's really about turning that tide, to stop the talent and the money from leaving, and instead to make Australia a truly competitive and, crucially, safe place to do crypto business in the Asia-Pacific. They're aiming to go toe-to-toe with hubs like Singapore and Hong Kong.
Which leaves us with one last really important question to think about. Does all this clarity, all this safety, come at the expense of that wild, permissionless innovation that crypto was famous for? Well, Australia has looked at the risks, they've looked at the rewards, and especially after the painful lessons from FTX, they've clearly made their choice. They're betting on a future built on legitimacy, consumer protection, and trust. The Wild West days are officially over.